Okay, wait. Before we start the Meta Mondays, I wanted to bring your guys' attention to a new update we just did on the matchup tips. So I'm going to make a whole video kind of talking about this and how it works, but this is a page on the site that's been outdated for a little while, and I just spent the whole day taking off stream to, do several things, but one of which was effectively overhaul this entire page. So how it works is really simple. You can go ahead and hover over like the play around cards. These are basically a list of cards that your opponent might have and play in different situations, and this gives you tips on how to play around certain things. So for example, if I queue into a match and my opponent is Freljord Ionia, I click Freljord Ionia. It's going to give me a little bit of a tip about how to play, what they're likely to have, and then it's going to show all the cards that are in those colors to play around. It's got a few features, like for example being smart enough to detect that certain cards are going to be limited outside of to specific region combinations, and that's it. This was just like a little thing. I think this is going to be helpful for a lot of you guys, especially newer players, but even players that aren't so new. Now, some of the tips on this page are going to be fairly straightforward. Like, for example, if we go to Shadow Isles Noxus, we've got spiders, and, we can say, oh, this is spiders, it's aggressive, here's what you want to do, here's how you want to mulligan, bada bing, bada boom. Let's go ahead and clear and check out Shadow Isles Bilgewater. This is deep, it's a bit more complex, there's a lot going on here, and we kind of teach how you want to be playing against these late game Shadow Isles decks as a whole. So obviously, it's going to be ranging quite a bit more advanced in a case like that. We also have a bunch of helpful probability tips. Like, for example, Judgment says here, the odds of them having the Garen judgment, the Garen specific judgment, given that there's Garen on the board, are roughly 20%. And there's a ton of math that goes into this. Basically, the odds of, them having it in their opening hand, the fact whether or not they mulligan it away, the given that is the first Garen being on the board, and then for some cards, like the ratioing the odds of it being a 2 of in the deck versus a 3 of. That being said, of course, it is a little rough, so there is going to be a margin, but these are, I think, going to be very helpful for a lot of you guys, and I spent a lot of time calculating it all out today. Anyway, that's it. This is matchup tips. It's going to be helpful for a lot of you guys, hopefully. There's 2 Arachnoid Sentries here. This is a bug, no pun intended, but there shouldn't be 2 Arachnoid Sentries here. If you're on the webpage right now, you shouldn't see 2 Arachnoid Sentries there. Hopefully, it'll have been fixed by the time this video is going out. Anyway, that's it. That's matchup tips. Back to you, Meta Mondays Swim. All right, thanks, shameless promotion, Swim. Okay, now, Meta Mondays, we've gotten it all hashed out here, and by a kind of miracle of coincidence, there actually happen to be 5 different tier, 5 decks in each tier. 5 tier 1 decks, 5 tier 2 decks, and 5 tier 3 decks. I did not plan it out like this. I did not go out of my way for it. It just so happens that's kind of how it aligned this week in terms of what's on the page. So, as always, we're going to do a fairly data-driven dive into what the meta has been like. I'm going to do something a little bit different this week. We are, of course, going to try to, do different things with the segment every week, and this is a series that I do want to kind of improve and evolve over time. And what we're going to do this week is we're actually going to use 2 different data sets. I'm going to talk about the win rate in Masters, and I'm going to talk about the win rate in all ladder games, so we can have a bit of a comparison and see which decks might be better at higher levels, whether it's because they're harder to play or whether they just counter the meta in Masters better. Okay, and let's jump right in with Tier 1. So, as we can see, Tier 1 is down to 5 different decks. Pretty expected. We had a pretty wacky 7-deck Tier 1 last time, and that's kind of how the start of a meta always is. I know that I saw some reactions that were like, what, 7 different Tier 1 decks? That's ludicrous. This is inaccurate as shit, or that general kind of approach. And honestly, it is kind of very strange, but the way that we define things on this tier list, in particular with regard to the start of a new patch when there's a lot more viability, there's going to be a large amount of tier 1 decks, and then it's going to be kind of a narrowing process over the next couple of weeks. There's a good chance it'll be 4 tier 1 decks next week, for example. All right, starting us out, we have Heimer Vi. Now, Heimer Vi is a deck that has basically seen kind of a rapid explosion of popularity in this past week, and its win rates come in at 60% in the Masters ladder, but only 55% in the global ladder. So what that's going to mean is, I think in this case that this deck is a little bit trickier to play. The biggest thing is probably people playing Heimerdinger when they can't protect him. A lot of people kind of too hastily dropping him on 5 or not saving mana to either protect him or get immediate tons of value out of him on the play. It is a pretty solid deck, and I'd happily recommend it to anybody looking to take the P&Z Ionia direction. Of course, the alternative being Karma Ezreal, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I want to bring your attention to this thing where it says last updated 7 days ago. I want to let you guys know every list on this sheet has been updated today. I have made sure everything is fully up to date. In this particular case, this list card for card is showing kind of like the highest win rate, and in my opinion, and just looking at it and having played it a bit, we have effectively an already optimal version here. So this just happens to be a list that hasn't needed to change, which isn't too surprising because it is very, very similar to the old Heimerdinger Karma lists, which also were very easily immediately optimized. Basically Vi swapped out for Karma, a couple of swap outs for the new cards, and that's it. Bada bing, bada boom. Alright, now deck number 2, Corvina Controller Karina with Vi. Now before we get into this, I'd like to point out 2 different things. As always, all the win rate stats gathered by Mobalytics for both Masters and Global Ladders can be seen by yourself in the pinned comment, as you can also get the link to this site and all of these decks that are going to be updated all the time. And, if you want that, go there. But also, on top of that, I just want to be pointing out, in the past, I've kind of made an effort to try to, order tiers in terms of, power level or viability within those tiers. I realize at this point that I think that is kind of a poor way of doing things. In reality, it has a really, really major problem communicating any sort of difference between those power levels. For example, if I thought there was one deck that was 2% above everything else, and then there was a second deck that was, and then these next 3 were all basically at the same level, and then this last one was kind of a bit lower, then there would be no representation of any of the disparages between each individual decks, and I think that can lead to very misleading situations where there can be 3 decks in a row that I rate as basically almost the same, which is pretty rare. Usually there's a minor discrepancy, and then because of that it can look like, oh, this deck is much better than this one, which is of course not true in that case. So I think I might reformat the tiering to have high tier 2, mid tier 2, or low tier 2. I don't know. If you have any ideas for how I can do this a little bit better, a little more accurately, let me know. But anyway, I've kind of I'm still doing it to some degree, but overall I wouldn't read too much into it, at least this week. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into Corvina Control, or Karina Vi. So this is basically the most general Shadow Isles control deck. Shadow Isles is kind of the go-to control region in Legends of Runeterra, and this is kind of the most abundant and staple one, coming in this week at a 60% win rate in Masters. Hey, look at that. As well as a 59% win rate outside of Masters on the global ladder, so of course that means it's, well, according to the stats, presumably either a bit better against that meta or more kind of beginner friendly, which I can't confirm. This is a pretty easy deck to play. There are, control decks. I would say for the most part, a lot of people look at aggro and control as difficulty ratings, and at the end of the day, there are control decks that are really hard. There are control decks that are really easy. There are aggro decks that are really easy. Aggro decks are really hard. This is a control deck that's pretty easy, all things considered. So it's by no surprise that it will come through at a pretty high win rate in the lower ranks. Overall, this is a great deck. It's going to stay in tier 1. I personally suspect that there might be kind of some new Shadow Isles decks that might start to overtake this, but we are not at that point yet, and Vi Karina stands strong as kind of one of the meta staples that just won't go away, at least for the time being. My preferred version here runs Atrocity and no Ruination. That is largely because good players play around Ruination to the point where it's not going to get too much value. That being said, I think that if you're having success with Ruination, don't be afraid at all to cut one Atrocity from one Ruination. Ruination is absolutely fine in this deck. It just doesn't work as well in the Master ranks. Okay, so moving right along, we've got Bannerman, everybody's favorite deck. Oh god, Bannerman is everyone's favorite deck, kind of like how I'm everyone's favorite streamer, it's I don't know about this one, right? Bannerman overall is a deck that has kind of just been dodging nerfs for ages, man, ages and ages. It's a very powerful deck coming in this week at actually a pretty limp 56% win rate. Not so hot after all. Now, surely you might say, well, Swim Bannerman is, a very good deck. You have it here in tier 1. It's pretty easy to play, quite brain dead. It's not a big brain deck like the ones I play. Bannerman is for simpletons, for single-minded people. Of course, Bannerman must have a high win rate at the lower ranks, right? No, it's actually 56% as well. And then you might wonder, well, Swim, what the hell is Bannerman doing in tier 1? And there's two reasons for that. Well, first of all, you know, I mean, it's really stable. That's actually not one of the reasons. This variant in particular is outperforming all of the others in terms of win rate, coming in at 58. And on top of that, there is the Vi Bannerman deck, where it's literally, well, there's a couple different versions, but the most common one is literally just replacing Garen for Vi, because people decided they'd rather have Challenger and Tough than whatever the hell Garen's doing in this deck, which I actually was very, very, very close to listing on this sheet. I might replace Garen for Vi next week, but that version also happened to be coming in at a pretty high win rate. So there's a lot of different ways of playing Bannerman, and overall, this is a deck that, you know, kind of like won't go away. If it gets dethroned, it will be next week by probably Lux Karma. More on that in a little bit. So if you want to swap out Garen for Vi, that's a perfectly fine change, and the list is going to do very well for you all the same. Overall, this version of Bannerman basically plays a lot more just like unit heavy for the board, making sure that your, you know, like AoE kind of like swarm incentivizer cards like Bannerman, Cytheria the Bold, and Ranger's Resolve are all picking up maximum targets. We're running stuff like Cytheria instead of a lot of the barrier cards that Bannerman decks of old have ran instead. Okay, moving right along, we've got Burn Aggro. Well, this one's really everybody's favorite deck. Coming in on Master's Ladder at a 57% win rate and the Global Ladder at a 58% win rate, it boasts pretty good stats, although, again, similar to Bannerman, you're probably thinking, wow, these are actually not as bad as I might have expected. The idea here is that it's actually a surprisingly difficult deck to play. I think that a lot of people look at this as like one of the most drooling, brain-dead decks ever. To be honest, look, I'm not going to say you have to be like a rocket scientist to play this deck, but overall, it's not quite as straightforward as it looks. This is one of the aggro decks where you do have to make a couple of like weird spot decisions. There's some like optimizing that is going to be a little counterintuitive here. There's going to be some spots where you're going to play like a little bit more kind of like defensively than others, like using your tools for clearing. And overall, like a lot of like the aggro decks, this deck is very, very, very punishing if you were to make a single mistake. For all of those reasons, I have listed this in the difficulty medium category, which, don't get me wrong, I think it's very hard in some ways, and I think it's ridiculously easy in others, but it's hard enough to earn itself the medium category. And I think that because of that, it is a deck that is kind of like underperforming, comparable to what it should be at lower ranks, whereas in higher ranks, basically every deck is rearing up to counter burn. Given all that, it actually might just be ejected out of tier 1 next week, potentially. Now, this is still an extremely powerful deck. I don't expect for it to go away, but the win rates have dropped from last week just because pretty much every deck that's on ladder needs to be effectively keeping this deck in mind and built in a major way to counter it. So as soon as, like, you know, burn drops down a little bit and decks kind of like ease up and kind of branch into other directions, burn will spike back up and it will effectively have a really hard time going away in any sort of major capacity here. I'd like to point out at this point, you guys are probably saying, wow, these win rate stats are kind of low. Usually the tier 1 decks are like 60% plus, like reliably. We've had 3 decks here that are below 60. What's going on? You know, and across like different skill levels too. Just because we have so much data coming in this next week. Masters, you know, there's a lot of people playing. There's a ton of games going on right now. Fresh expansion, everyone's playing. You should just check out the actual stats. I'll just show you here. Look at this. Games played. 112,000. This is for the kind of top of this area. This is kind of like the most played deck, which is Burn, by the way, to nobody's surprise. But 112,000. The sample size here is insane. It's out of this universe. It's like 10 times what it was kind of in the previous week, right? So overall, you know, law of large numbers is going to dictate that we shouldn't be surprised seeing a lot of, like, you know, decks that are closer to high 50s when normally tier 1 decks would be 60 plus, period. Okay. Anyway, Burn, pretty good deck. Nobody's surprised. Karma Ezreal. Oh, yeah, I guess I should mention my preferred version of Burn right now is currently running 1 Static Shock, just for a little bit more extra sustain. Overall, there was the 3 Static Shock version. This is actually kind of outdated because it was Winding God's version that was the 3 Static Shock version. It worked very well for me at first, but I decided ultimately 3 Static Shocks is a little bit too many, which a lot of you guys who have played the 3 Static Shock version will probably be able to confirm, depending. Anyway, overall, it's a powerful deck. Okay, next up, last in tier 1, Karma Ezreal. So this is going to come in Masters win rate 58. Pretty good. Ladder, global ladder, 54. It is a pretty tricky deck to play overall. It is not, this is actually, I would say, one of the harder decks to play in the entire game. We can see that as the hard category here. It's pretty tricky. It takes a lot of nuance. You need to know exactly how to use your tools in the right way. This is an example of a, well, it's not, I don't think I'd call this a control deck, although it is getting a lot more control tools, but it's an example of a deck that does take, I would say, quite a bit more kind of skill and decision making than something like Karina, even though they do use decent amount of the same tools. Overall, you're basically just stalling, looking to level up either Ezreal or Karma on turn 10. And of course, this is a strategy that we've seen being wildly effective in the past. A lot of supplemental draw tools like Deep Meditation, of course, just being an amazing card overall for Ionia. Ionia got a crazy amount of bombs, huh? This expansion, just nutty region all of a sudden, eh? Anyway, I do want to say, oddly enough, Karma Ezreal might be on a bit of a decline, and especially to people that were playing the game before the expansion, that's going to seem very strange, very, very strange, because Karma Ezreal was arguably the strongest deck. It was basically, you could argue it was the second strongest deck, but it was a really, really good deck before the expansion, and they gave it a bunch of new tools. It got some of the most new tools out of everything. So how could this deck possibly be a consideration to, some people are expecting that it would drop at a tier 1. There's some people that already wouldn't put it in tier 1. Well, there's a lot of other decks that are kind of rising up to do what this deck is already doing, but in some ways a little bit better. For example, being in P and Z without being in Vi right now is proving to be a, generally speaking, kind of wasted opportunity. Vi is a really, really powerful card for any slow P and Z deck. Aggro kind of being, the one exception to that, because of course aggro is very fast. So, not being able to run Vi is a little tricky. There's just kind of no way to fit it into a deck like that. But also, it's just kind of the idea of a super slow, just win the game at 10 deck is a fairly contested idea right now. I mean, of course, the Shadow Isles version with Karina Vi is doing a bit better right now, and it uses a kind of similar, just end the game at round 10 sort of strategy, but mostly it gets to feed off of Burn, whereas Karma Ezreal has a big problem with Burn. Burn is keeping Karma Ezreal at bay a bit right now, actually quite a bit more than a bit. And then on top of that, you've got the competition in decks like Lux Karma as well, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, which is also a very powerful deck that got a lot of new tools that is kind of doing the same exact thing. They're using Ionia tools to stall until, kind of the Karma flip or even before then, and you're just going to be able to blow out the game in the late game, guaranteed. So overall, Karma Ezreal is still a powerful deck. The stats are still coming in pretty good. And hey, if Burn gets the nerf that a lot of people are expecting, Karma Ezreal could definitely be a deck that, remains kind of a meta nightmare for months to come. Who knows? But overall, this deck is actually still pretty good. I have it listed at tier 1, and, its win rates are fine, but it's not as ridiculously strong as a lot of people, myself included, were thinking that it probably would be. And while we're on the topic of predictions I got wrong, then we've also got Misfortune. Yeah, we'll get into that whole thing just a little bit. Lux Karma first. So we enter tier 2. Now, how is Lux Karma doing? BPG and I are actually pretty similar deck builders, all things considered. Mostly we're on the same wavelength when it comes to list. A lot of our lists end up looking pretty similar. Whereas just again, this is a whole tangent, of course, but whereas if you compare a lot of my decks or his decks to the decks of, say, for example, Alan, Alan is a weird deck builder. It's which is, it's obviously not a bad thing. It's just a very, very different style, but those decks are going to be something that's very, very different. BBG and I, our decks are almost always a few cards off of each other's. Anyway, Karma Lux. Well, it's a powerful deck. What did it get? Well, it got some new tools. Of course, it got all the great things in Ionia. Again, Ionia is just like I think I would actually feel comfortable saying that Ionia might be the strongest region in the game right now, which seems like a little bit of a hot take because, of course, you know, it only has like 2 instances in the top 5. You see like Karina Control not run it, Bannerman, of course, just doing Bannerman things, and Burn Aggro's kind of doing Burn Aggro things. But I actually do think that a lot of Ionia decks are going to be like kind of on the rise. I think that they're pretty insane right now. Like you might see that PNZ is a stronger color, and honestly, if you're looking at its representation in tier 1, PNZ is definitely stronger. But I guess I would say PNZ is kind of more versatile. Like they have good like mid-range aggro and control tools, whereas Ionia is only really good at doing one thing, but they're absolutely insane at doing that one thing. Anyway, tangent over. So Karma Lux. How does this deck do? Well, of course, you're gonna like try to make it until turn 10. You're gonna try to be leveling your champions. It is a deck that kind of has a hard time surviving in the early game, so the idea is level your champion. You're always kind of like double skipping your turn into a Remembrance on turn 3, or sometimes, you know, a Badger Bear if, you know, nothing else, a Shadow Assassin. And the advent of Grizzled Ranger is actually going to do a lot in terms of helping your Radiant Guardian go off. Basically, your opponent can like never block your Grizzled Ranger when Radiant Guardian is going to be potentially a threat to come down, right? Absolutely massive, because you're just going to trigger more deaths. So you're going to have a lot of Radiant Guardians that are coming down with lifesteal, and that will be a massive win condition against decks like aggro, for example, where you need to be protective of your health. But even outside of that, even like mid-range mirrors, like the tough stat on this is just super, super valuable. And of course, it's not just Ionia that got new shiny tools, but it is also Demacia. They've got Badger Bear and Grizzled Ranger, and of course, you know, Unyielding Spirit's pretty solid. They got an extra synergy point with Radiant Guardian. This card got indirectly buffed because of, you know, like I say, Grizzled Ranger, as well as Eye of the Dragon potentially. So this is a list that comes together very, very, very powerfully. Now, I suspect this list, or a refined version of this list, it'll be a few cards different. I suspect that a refined version of this list will be tier 1 next week. Now, why am I not comfortable putting this in tier 1 yet? Well, when we compare the win rates with Bannerman, first of all, Bannerman has a higher win rate at lower points of ladder. Lux Karma is a bit harder to play, but the reason is pretty simple. It's got a low sample size, so it's kind of like a little bit hard to say if the statistical relevance is really there. I think it's a very, very powerful list, but I've become a lot more hesitant to like immediately put lists that kind of haven't been proven in the past into something like tier 1. I've gotten very excited in the past. It's not a good property for like, you know, tier lister makers, where it's like there's been a list that I'm like, oh god, it's so good, I'll put it in tier 1, and then it's like one or two times, I think it happened like twice, where I put some new concept in tier 1 and it ended up just like fizzling out. It wasn't bad, but it ended up being like a tier 2 concept in like the next week. And ultimately, I want to be a bit more cautious. So when I see something where, you know, Lux Karma is a deck we've seen in the past, but it's never really been super tier 1 before or anything like that. So at a low sample size, I'm going to tenuously put this in tier 2 for now, but maybe it'll trade places with Bannerman next week. Okay, now Misfortune Scouts. This is the deck. This is the deck that I was probably the most wrong about. I went on the record saying I think Quinn was going to be a pretty weak card. And don't get me wrong, it's like she was overrated at the start of the expansion. I think that much is pretty true. It's like on day 1 or 2, this was a very, very popular deck. And it's died down significantly since then, both in play rate and win rate. So yes, Quinn was, and I did say this in the first day or 2 of the patch, overrated at that point in time. That being said, when we had the pre-patch predictions, I was saying Quinn is likely going to be a very weak champion that doesn't really have a home at all, and she has a pretty great home in this deck in particular, which is like kind of like aggro Demacia looking to get extra attacks in. She's a lot better in this list than I gave her credit for, and ultimately, this is a pretty powerful list, even though its win rate has died down just a little bit. Now, it's got a 55% win rate in Masters, pretty low, but a 60% win rate in Global Ladder, which is, I think, the first time in this video so far that we've had a deck that had a higher win rate in Global Ladder than Masters Ladder. Overall, this shouldn't be too surprising either. It's a deck that's not only, like, it's not that it's easy to play, that's part of it. Mostly it's that it will be kind of more punished by better decks, right? The Scout ability and just like Rally as a concept in general, anything that does extra attacks will basically do a very good job of punishing unrefined concepts, which means this is a large part of why I was predicting in the first day or two of the patch when people were hitting Masters with this deck that it was kind of overrated, and while it's still a strong deck, would probably die down a bit because, of course, again, these mechanics capitalize, they just devour unrefined decks, which you're going to see in the early days of the meta. But B, it means it's also pretty good at lower ranks. So it's a great climbing deck. It's going to climb you pretty fast. If you have some kind of like weird moral high horse against playing Burn, but paradoxically you're totally okay playing Demacia, I don't know. I mean, look, listen. It's a good deck. You can totally climb with this. It's going to do very well for you. If you're interested in kind of anything in these regions, it's going to be a much more aggressive version of Bannerman, basically. Now, one thing I will say is that this particular version of the list, this exact build, not any MF Scouts deck as a whole, but this version, card for card, actually came in Masters win rate with a 68% win rate. Now, it's a low sample size, it's 200 and something games, but it is actually possible that this is an underrated tier 1 concept, and in reality, it's just most people playing this archetype or building wrong versions of the list. Who knows? Either way, this version is a little hot if we're going to ignore the statistical relevance of sample size and its big, huge number on its win rate. Maybe this deck is nuts. But anyway, if you're going to play an MF Scouts deck, and I do actually want to say, like, most of this list, I kind of like, I think I haven't made this, like, clear enough in the past, but for the most part, this is like an archetype tier list. If you want to use a version of this deck, like, if you, like, are playing your own deck, or you're watching another streamer or YouTuber, and they're playing a deck that's, like, literally, like, 3 or 4 cards different, like, everyone has their own, like, minute versions of, you know, minor differences, they're totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's like, this is just purely archetypes. Like, for example, I think a lot of people are running, like, Alan's version of Karina instead of this one. They're gonna be very, very similar. I think it's total, like, 5 cards off or something like that. I'm not saying this one is necessarily better. It's really, really close. I like this one better, but overall, the variations don't make that much of a difference. Now, in this case, though, if we're going by the stats, if you're going to play MF Scouts, I'd highly recommend this version. Most notably, what we can see here is that Citrus Courier is busted, and Relentless Pursuit is just kind of like a poor version of Citrus Courier. I actually have a little bit of a prediction that we're going to see some like really dumb Citrus Courier deck or two start to crop up in the next like 2 weeks or so. I think that this card is really, really, really strong, and people just have not optimized the right exact decks for it quite yet, but we'll see. Then we've got Standalone Node TK. Truly, and I know this is the 3rd time I've said this in this video, but this is actually everyone's favorite deck. So I've actually been playing this list a bunch in the past week. There was one day on stream where I played nothing except for this list, much to the chagrin of my Twitch chat audience. People were dropping like flies. Anyway, basically, I personally think this is a very strong deck right now. It rides in at a 61% win rate. Say what? Yeah, I know, right? 61% win rate in Masters with a still somewhat acceptable 54% win rate in Global Ladder. Yeah, that one's not so great. But hey, it's a pretty good deck. In fact, with these win rates, wow, it's basically a tier 1 deck. This has actually better win rate stats than some of the tier 1 decks, like 1 or 2 of the tier 1 decks that I listed above. So what's going on? Well, first of all, I mean, sample size, like always. And second of all, this list is kind of like, it's not really super stable, it's really high variance, it's going to get a lot of surprise value. It does not have the qualities that a tier 1 deck should. That being said, this is a very powerful list, it's very disgusting. Now, if you don't know how this list works, let me go ahead and walk you through it. You skip the first 2 turns, and then you play Zed, and then you make your Zed really big, and then you swing into your opponent, and then sometimes you swing into your opponent again, and then sometimes a 3rd time, but usually they're already dead, actually. So, yeah, that's it. That's kind of the deck. Now, a lot of games aren't going to go that simply, Sometimes you'll have to buff Fiora, you'll play for single combat. We've got Unyielding Spirit to potentially use on Zed or Fiora, and there will be occasions where in this case we might buff like a Solitary Monk. In this version we are running 1. And overall, I will say, as fun as it is to meme about how dumb this deck is, and when you draw well, it's the most brainless deck in the world, right? Plays out on 3, play standalone on 3, the game is often over unless your opponent has Will of Ionia, right? Period. Now, what I will actually say, though, and I'm not joking when I say this is one of the hardest lists to play in the entire game. Okay? Now, I did list it at medium for the same reason that I listed Burn Aggro at medium, because at the end of the day, the skill floor is very high. It's low? Yeah, sorry, low skill floor. It's very easy to play overall to a basic level, but playing this deck well is really, really quite difficult. You will have to do a lot of like very, very weird things. You will have to play around tools very well from the opponent's side of things. You will have to do a lot of like stuff like probability calculation, and even like hand reading helps a deck like this. At the end of the day, this is just a very, very all-in deck that makes you play the game in an extremely different way. I compared playing this deck to playing poker, because it just comes down to probabilities and hand reading more than anything else, and nothing like normal concepts of value don't matter with a deck like this, and I actually really enjoy it for that, although a lot of you guys think I'm a degenerate who must have had a really fucked up childhood because I enjoy it. But I mean, maybe. But my childhood aside, I think that this is actually a list that will make you a lot better at the game. If you play this list and if you get good at playing this, the skills that you'll develop in terms of how this list makes you think about the game, especially if you go by, you know, the guide that I made on this list before, will actually make you a much better player and transfer it to a lot of other decks. Anyway, it's a good deck. I'm not going to be like biased and put it in tier 1 just because it's my baby. It's a very powerful deck, but yeah, tier 2 ultimately ain't nothing wrong with that either. They Who Endure. Now, this comes in at a 56% win rate, and this is actually a deck that I played most of the way into Masters during my kind of Masters climb. It took us 2 days to get from D4 to Masters, which is actually, I'm not really proud of. That's longer than it should have been. It should have been a 1-day climb, but yeah, a two-day climb to get from D4 to Masters. Most of the way with this deck, although we did some sea monsters and a little bit of burn. So, this is a pretty powerful deck. Ultimately, it comes in at 56% win rate on both the Masters and Global ladder. And, hey, it's pretty straightforward. You play a lot of weenie blockers, kind of stall out the game by, kind of chump blocking a bunch of dudes over and over again. And then usually you'll be playing your They Who Endure somewhere between turns 8 and 11. And it'll usually be like a really large dude at that point in time. Start shoving into your opponent. How it usually works is you do one swing and force them to react to your swing, like they'll have to will it or something, and then when they go in to remove it, that's when you atrocity them in response, just killing them on the spot. And there's a lot of situations where you'll use your atrocity kind of like before that point, and that's fine. Overall, this is a deck that is pretty good. It's going to be a very fair deck. I mean, 56 on both win rates. This is like the just smack middle of tier 2. It's solid. I actually find this archetype a lot of fun, and we were running Neverglade Collectors at the end, and this card was actually doing quite well. It just can be an alternate win condition in and of itself. The version we were running was, kind of like the full Allegiance version with Callistas, and this one Rosso was actually paying off in quite a lot of ways. Actually, there's an interesting calculation that we did. Part of like the odds that we were calculating on the mashup tiffs. One of them was, of course, the atrocity odds. And a lot of math went into this, and again, it is a generalization. Sorry, I thought I clicked on Shadow Owls. But we came to the conclusion that against They Who Endure, again, this is a generalization. It's estimating like an average turn that they're going to be threatening it on, plus like the average amount of atrocities that They Who Endure decks run, which is somewhere between 2 and 3. We estimate like 2.5 because a lot of them are running 3, and then auto mulliganing it, getting in that turn, the average amount of draws they'll get until then, and I got 55%, which is actually, this is the kind of calculation which I wasn't actually really sure of, and this will actually help me, right? There's a lot of these that I kind of intuitively know off the top of my head, like a lot of the benchmarks, like any random 3 of that you keep in the mulligan is going to be a 60% from turn 3 onward. That's the kind of stuff that you should just know. That's a great benchmark. there's a lot of these calculations that I didn't really know. So this just came to mind, and this is actually going to help me kind of like play a lot of late game positions against that deck. Anyway, back to the They Who Endure, and then finally we put in Callista at the end, which I wasn't running for most of my games, but I put it in at the end, and it was actually performing very well. So this is kind of my preferred They Who Endure deck, and I think this will take you the furthest. Oh, also, this list absolutely destroys burn. If you're looking to like counter burn with a vengeance, you're just going to be looking for Shadow Isles decks in general. Basically, is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm actually going to refer you guys to my little meta triangle, which is going to get a visual update. If you look at it on the site after this video is posted, it might already have that visual upgrade. But we've got the classic triangle here. So aggro, which is burn in this case, we can see if you want to beat aggro, you should try playing the deck that's labeled control, which basically in Runeterra kind of means Shadow Isles. It's kind of hard to have like an actual proper control deck without Shadow Isles. There's just kind of like nothing that has that amount of tools. And They Who Endure is a good example of a deck that will dumpster aggro, as will any efficient slow Shadow Isles deck will be able to dumpster aggro. Okay, so great burn counter. Okay, then we've got Twisted Fate Yoink. Now this is a deck, I played a bunch of Twisted Fate decks on stream. We got some great highlights, you might have seen it on this channel. Hilarious deck, very rewarding, very fun to play. This is kind of the most fun I've had in Runeterra. It's very challenging, it's very hilarious at the same time. I love this deck, and there's a lot of ways to build it too. I was messing around with like PNZ versions, Shadow Isles versions. I'm throwing the Ionia version up here, and by the way, you'll notice this is very similar to the Twisted Fate Lee Sin deck that we put on the site for week 1. It ends up being built a little bit differently. This one's much more optimized, of course. It would be more optimized than a Theorycraft deck, because that was one we made purely on Theorycraft. So we changed several cards, but ultimately concept's the same. And it's a deck that I feel is actually pretty competent. Now, this doesn't have enough of a ladder representation to have like an actual, stable win rate. So it's kind of like a bit of a guess where it will end up. I've got it tenuously at the bottom of tier 2 for now, but I actually think that Twisted Fate decks might be on the rise. I'm not sure if Ionia will be the best way to run it. There will be others, but I personally will spend the next week kind of experimenting with different Twisted Fate decks and kind of seeing exactly where I feel like the archetype is. I should probably point out how the list plays, because I don't know, I'm kind of like bad at that. There's some things that I kind of like forget to mention. Basically, you draw a bunch of cards, you try to level your Twisted Fate, you play a bunch of spells, your spells will interact with, you've got the Ionia package, so you've got Deep Meditation, you've got Salamanders coming out, and this is a list that will committally try to flip Twisted Fate. Twisted Fate is a flexible card. You can run this either as a value tool, a reactive value tool, just, threatening red card, etc. That's fine. Flexible, reactive, value, you don't need to flip him. Or you can build around him and try to level him up and use him as a win condition. This deck does the latter. Now, both versions are fine. In fact, most decks will use him in kind of a non-committal way. But it's very powerful and very fun when you can build a deck around leveling him. And it might seem like we don't have a ton of ways to protect him here, but in reality, usually when they go in to kill the Twisted Fate, if I can level him up, even if he dies, they'll threaten him with I don't know, let's say a vengeance, doesn't matter, right? But he'll be 5 out of 8, so when there's spells in the air, I'll level him up there, and then he'll die. But you have so much draw in this deck that you'll just get another one, and it'll be leveled. And when you can stick a leveled Twisted Fate on the board, you actually kind of just win. It's really absurd. Okay, so then we've got the tier 3 decks, the so-called runts of the litter. Twisted Keg Control. Now, tier 3 decks are defined here. These are, win rate is not the only metric we're using, but as a rule of thumb, if you are going to go by win rate, tier 3 is defined as hover around 50%. That's a nice way of saying, they ain't necessarily great, right? Twisted Keg Control. Keg Control as an archetype is a deck that I previewed on this stream a while ago. We threw up the version by Mago, which was kind of a lot of fun. We ended up trying it in a tournament, and I played several games on it with LoR, had a lot of fun. A lot of you guys were saying it was some of the most fun you had playing the game, the good old Keg Control deck. This is one that takes it in a slightly different direction, but before I talk about this list, let's talk about the archetype win rate as a whole, which is, Keg Control and variations of Keg Control. In Masters, Keg Control comes in with a absolutely flaccid 49% win rate. But it is redeemed by its 56% win rate on all ranks. Now, this deck that you see before you is not the same exact list. It's using a lot of the component cards, but this one plays for, as we saw earlier, the same kind of like Twisted Fate side plan. So you're doing kegs as well as kind of like Twisted Fate at the same time. You can blow your opponent out. You're likely going to be trying to like draw into your Twisted Fate win, although you can often just win with the control win condition of stabilizing. At the end of the day, like a real control deck only needs like pretty soft win conditions. Like if your win condition is just outvalue and stabilize, that's kind of like gonna be what you're doing most of the time, and that's why we have good trades like keg plus AoE. Well, you can just win off of that, because even if you're not killing your opponent Nexus or ending the game, if you're starving your opponent out of resources and outvaluing them, that is control's fundamental win condition overall, right? Which isn't to say it's not a good idea to have some supplemental win conditions, but they're less needed in control. So I think this is a pretty good take on Twisted Keg Control. It's a great kind of like mashup of the archetypes, and each other's weaknesses will help support the other. Overall, this is a very, very fun deck. If you guys are looking for a good time and you have similar preferences to me, well, hopefully they're not too similar, because I find this deck fun for some reason, but unironically, you guys will really, really enjoy Twisted Fate Yoink and Twisted Keg Control. These are very, very fun, challenging, and rewarding decks that play different every time. Okay, Draven Spiders. Draven Spiders is an archetype that a lot of people were saying is dead. It is not in a great position right now, but it's not unplayable. The archetype comes in at a 57% win rate on normal ladder. Hey, that's not bad. And it's literally completely absent from Masters ladder. Like nobody's playing this deck in Masters. It's not a bad list. It's pretty solid. Unfortunately, the biggest problem is right now we're in a meta where a lot of decks are kind of forced into stuff like Withering Wail, and this deck, even though it's very powerful, even though it wins a lot of games very fast, and even though it'll perform very well even against Burn, like this should win the mirror match against Burn most of the time. It's going to be a little favored. Overall, the fact that your game can just be over to something like one Withering Wail or something like one red card makes this ultimately just a list that kind of has to stay tier 3 for the time being. Okay, then we've got Sea Monsters. God, I said to myself I was going to make these videos shorter. I just want to let you guys know. I think I'm at like the 40-minute mark of recording or something like that. I have no idea what the timestamp is right now on your video that you're watching this, but I'm deep, and I need to like make these shorter, because I feel like a lot of people are probably not a fan of like these hour-long podcasts that these have turned into. Anyway, I digress. This is Sea Monsters. Now, there's a few different versions of Sea Monsters, but this is kind of like my personal stance on it. We went through a lot of different versions. This is one of the decks that we climbed to Masters with, although this one had like kind of like a barely positive win rate the entire time. It wasn't really like a super high win rate. Had a lot of fun though. Ultimately, I think that the biggest thing about the Sea Monsters archetype is you don't want to run a ton of Sea Monsters. I would say any more Sea Monsters than this amount here is basically a mistake. Maybe you can run like one or two more potentially, but mostly you just want to run a lot of stall tools, a few Sea Monsters to potentially be, closing out the games, as well as some of them kind of like helping you get there. And mostly you're going to be ending a lot of games with your kind of like big boy Nautilus, as well as, some of the bigger Sea Monsters here, right? And you'll just be kind of forcing games to end after a certain point. Maokai's in the list. Sometimes he's going to help you get to deep, with one Twisted Fate just as kind of like the reactive card you can play him for, red or gold or blue, whatever he's going to be used for. Now, Sea Monsters comes in at a 54% win rate at Masters, pretty much what you'd expect, and a 56% on normal ladder, so not so terrible. They do better, of course, in environments that allow for kind of like slower decks to exist. But ultimately, like the general consensus among Masters players right now is that if you're going to play a Shadow Isles kind of like stall deck, you're probably better off playing something other than the Sea Monsters kind of like deep version. Now, of course, this is a very fun deck. A lot of people like this deck. I'm not here to call your guys' decks bad. In fact, the difference between a bad and good deck isn't that big of a difference, right? Like, I want to stress this. A lot of people will hear me say a deck is like tier 2 or something like that, and they'll be kind of sad. They'll be like, oh, I wanted to play that deck. I can't play that deck now. Guys, it's a few percentage points. If you want to play it, go ahead. I'm not trying to say don't play this or do play this. I'm giving you recommendations, and I'm giving you stats, and I'm giving you advice, and, it'll definitely allow you to climb faster. You can make masters with any of the decks on this list, although, okay, don't try it with one of these two. But you can make masters with any of the decks on this list, right? Some of them are going to take you longer. Tier 3 decks are going to take you longer. But just because I say that Sea Monsters is going to be basically a slightly worse version of other Shadow Isles decks, like even, They Who Endure, most notably in this case Karina, that doesn't mean you shouldn't play it. It's not going to be that different. A couple win rates points off. It's a lot of fun. Okay, then we've got Swain Sejuani. So this was a kind of like last minute ad. We were doing the kind of like Mobalytics, kind of like meta tier list that we do here. It's a little list that we do with Alan actually every week here, which is kind of like a tier list on the site. It will differ from the one on my site only a little bit, mostly just in terms of like some minor structure things. And there's a couple of lists that I will kind of like rank slightly different on my own personal site than the consensus we reach over here. But usually, like, everything is the same tier. Overall, it's sorry, I was gonna say, basically we were talking about the tier list earlier, and during the discussion Alan was like, this Swain Sejuani deck was pretty good. So this is Alan's Swain Sejuani deck, because I know a lot of you guys are looking for Sejuani decks, and I know a lot of you guys are looking for Swain decks, and this is a deck that he's been having a lot of success with, and I tried for a few games on ladder, and I really liked. Overall, it's a pretty sweet list. Basically, the idea behind this is pretty straightforward. You're just going to be going for, Plunder triggers. It's got a nice, like, amount of, like, early sustain in the form of, like, Disciple, Omenhawk Transfusion, and Death's Hand, while you're just kind of, like, ramping into your huge dudes later. The number one thing with this deck is you want to make sure you're plundering with Wolf Rider on 4. So if you don't have Ember Maiden on the board on turn 3, you need to bank a mana for Death's Hand so that you can Death's Hand into Wolf Rider on turn 4, right? That's really important. And then, of course, on turn 8, you're going to slam a big ship, and that big ship's going to win you the game. If you've played Wolf Rider, it'll usually be happening on turn 7. Overall, if you're looking to use one of these champions, or maybe even both of them, this is a nicely optimized list to do so with. Now, it's actually possible this list will come in with decent stats. It's a pretty, like, underplayed concept, so we don't have any stats on it, but it's actually not impossible that this will end up with, like, a tier 2 win rate. It's, I mean, okay, I'm not going to call it likely, but who knows, right? And that just leaves us with Milkai. Oh, man, Milkai, what happened to you? I was so excited when the patch was coming out. The idea of a Maokai list that just played to mill the opponent out was a pretty cool idea. Get them down to 0 and then deck them out with, like, Pilfered Goods. Like, when the Maokai flips, you Pilfered Goods, and then they draw their last pathetic card, and then they lose, Yu-Gi-Oh! And then they lose the game. It's great. I love the idea of a mill deck. Unfortunately, this one just ended up being very short in terms of kind of resources, too slow of a win condition, and very similar to the idea of a deep deck, which shouldn't be surprising because they're using, like, many of the same cards. At the end of the day, you're kind of better off playing Shadow Isles plus X instead of, in this case, Shadow Isles plus Bilgewater. Well, I mean, the keg stuff isn't really that bad. It's not like Shadow Isles plus Bilgewater is inherently bad. It's just like the toss stuff, like the deep stuff and the Maokai stuff. It's a little wonky. It has a hard time getting past tier 3, but, I mean, these are competitive tiers. These are still competitive decks. You might see some weird formats where, some people will bring, like, these kinds of things into just the right tournament lineup, or, just the right kind of, like, off-meta counter to things. These are still solid decks, I mean, they're above 50%. Well, most of them are anyway. Anyway, that's it, guys. That's the Meta Mondays for this upcoming Monday. We have successfully gotten 2 Mondays in a row, so let's move that slider. Where's that meme where it's like it's the you know, the like number of days since accident, except it's like Meta Mondays on a Monday in a row. 2 in a row. That's crazy. All right, guys. That's about all I got for this Meta Mondays. See you guys next week.